Namo Sambuddhasa. Homage to the Buddha, the blessed, noble, and fully self-awakened one. So we're looking at this idea of hope. At the top of my page, I've got faith, hope, aspiration, expectation, disappointment. So the idea is to define all this and to see what the Buddha's actually saying. So faith, of course, often translated as confidence, trust. It's a foundational virtue, yeah. So it's one of the five spiritual faculties: faith, effort, mindfulness, concentration, insight, wisdom. And for our purposes, there are two pretty obvious enemies. One is to turn it into a belief system, which would then stop you from investigating. So it's the process of investigation, which is the process of liberation. And the subtle one about, now I'm going to use the word hope because that's how it's defined in the scriptures. There is skeptical doubt. We'll come to that a little later. So we've got to make clear what we mean by faith, and then we can understand a bit more the other stuff. So remember that all our problems root back into this idea of a self, which doesn't like to, it likes to know what's going to happen. It's forever planning, organizing the future. And once we come across the Buddha Dharma, we hear about this goal, Nibbana, for some of us anyway. We don't have an idea of what Nibbana is, and yet there's some sort of hazy concept. And we're told it's the end of suffering, the end of compulsive desiring. That doesn't tell us what the actual experience is. And even when the Buddha's explicit, so-called explicit anyway, talks about a consciousness without boundary, without an object, full of light, we still have to exercise our imagination as to find, to sort of come up with something. And then we sort of have an idea that this is what Nibbana is. So we strive. The yogi sits full throttle, see, noting diligently the three characteristics of existence, how we create suffering through a wrong desire, impermanence, not self, but subconsciously somewhere trying to achieve the escape from suffering, which is another way of expressing Nibbana. So, of course, it ends with disappointment, which it has to do because the subtle aim is not true. We're sort of chasing a false idea, fake idea. And of course, it's exhausting. Yeah, you're making this great big effort, getting nowhere. So what we have to understand is that when we're practicing, the purpose is just to see these three characteristics. So, okay, the subtlety of the Buddhist teaching. The subtlety of the Buddhist teaching is to distinguish between an aim, which is a bit fuzzy for us, and the immediate objective, which gets us there, which is to observe and examine exactly what's before us, what we're actually experiencing at this moment. And those are the three characteristics. So we've got an example of wrong effort from a monk called Sona. So he was desperately trying to get fully liberated and over-efforting, and was about to leave the order when the news came to the Buddha. He goes to see him and talks about tuning a vina. So that's an instrument like a lute. Too tight, doesn't work. Too loose, you don't get the note. And so ultimately, you've got to get it just right. So that's to do with getting it right, is to do with our intention. Once the intention is right, which is just to discover, experience the three characteristics, that's enough. We don't have to worry about the future. Anyway, you can understand from our life experience, having expectations often leads to, disappointment. Now, in the actual discourses, the word for hope, asa, doesn't get good press at all. So it seems to be understood as a sort of subtle form of craving, and it's linked to failure and suffering in itself because it's never fulfilled. Somehow it's got to be transcended. So the Buddha talks about nirasa, which we translate as hopelessness. Well, that gets us towards despair. So there must be some some misunderstanding here somewhere. Anyway, I'll give you a flavor of what it says in the Discourses. So this is one living in hope and one who has abandoned hope, one who is cut off, lost, and one who's at peace. So one who lives in hope is going to be cut off and lost. So that doesn't sound so good for us. Then it goes on, hope is suffering in the world. The person who lives with hope is called one who is defeated. When one's hope fails, one's hopes fails, disappointment arises and it is suffering. And then we've got a verse from a nun, Mutta Teri, so one of the enlightened nuns of the period, translated by Norman, who's an expert in this. And somehow she says, that hope which some have here for children and wives and for the love of a woman, such hope does not apply to me. So I don't quite know how that fits her as a woman, but anyway, again, she's abandoned all worldly hopes, at least. So you can see that in the scriptures, in the Discourses, hope has a sort of shade of yearning for some outcome, slips into expectation. Now, in the Mahayana, it's redeemed, at least in our understanding of hope, but they do use a different word, pranidhana, which in the Pali, the language of our Discourses, is panidhana, which means aspiration, a longing. So it fits into the Mahayana because of their bodhicitta ideal, which is a heart devoted to awakening through compassion. So the Bodhisattva vow, as I think most of you know, is a vow to redeem everyone before yourself. It's a universal awakening rather than a personal attainment. But again, that word, there is a word in Sanskrit, asha, which means hope. It's not used. So it's all a bit semantic. We have to just work out what this actually means. But of course, in our terms, if there's no hope, then the practice feels as though it's going to run into a cul-de-sac, yeah? Okay, so if we look at the word aspiration, that I think gets us better on the path. So here we have a word like chanda. So chanda is one of the 4 bases of spiritual power, which I covered in January 23. I'm sure you all remember it. Then the other 3 of the 4 bases are effort, consciousness, and investigation. So we said that at the time that these 4 bases of power can be used in ordinary daily life. So you need obviously a desire to achieve something, and then you need the effort to get there. You need consciousness, of course, and then you need the ability to figure out what to do, the investigation. So here we have this word chanda, which means a very strong desire. And then we have the word samvega. The Buddha goes on about samvega. So this is a sort of religious fervor. It's a heartfelt desire to attain something. Now, in the Visuddhimagga, which is the medieval spiritual manual, he points to 8 objects which induce this sort of devotion. Gives us a sense of urgency about our practice. I don't think any of them will come as a surprise. Birth, aging, sickness, and death, of course. Contemplating those, contemplating the idea that if we don't do the practice and we fall into error, we'll end up in one of the apaya realms, which is either purgatory. Sometimes that's translated as hell, but it's not permanent, remember, thank heavens. And then there's rebirth as an animal or as a hungry ghost, always feeling empty. And in the realm of conflict, the asura realm. So, and of course, finally, as number 8, there is just being here in this world of samsara, the world of onward going, led by delusion. But you can see that these realms are also quite obvious to us right here and now in the world. So, this desire, this eagerness to become liberated, you have to be careful not that it doesn't corrupt into expectation. And this is where faith comes in, really. So we've got faith, which is, remember, not a belief, right? It's a sense of trust, of confidence. So without that, of course, you don't do anything, right? I mean, the obvious enemy here is skeptical doubt, so, which is obviously based on, or usually based on, some sort of fear, fear of failure, fear of being fooled, and so on. Now, if we don't have that faith, that sort of faith, then you don't make a decision. You can't make a decision. You can't act. And this is true in daily life. It can become a bit destructive. If a person can't make up their mind about someone they're attracted to, a job they've applied for, well, the opportunity just slips away. I had a student actually for a while who couldn't decide whether to get out of bed or not. It can become a bit of a mental illness, I think. So even if we have this great confidence in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and the Eightfold Path, see, it doesn't mean it's unshakable until we reach first path and fruit. That's when we have such a clear insight into one of those three characteristics of existence that our faith becomes unshakable. We just know it's right. But until then, there's always a danger of losing it. And one of them is the bad behavior of monks. So everybody goes around saying it's hypocritical. But the other, of course, is that we have this unrealistic aim. That's the expectation. And then we sort of drop out and we try something else. So now, for some people who achieve liberation, faith is their dominant quality. It doesn't mean to say they don't have to, understand or experience the three characteristics of existence. It just means that it doesn't have to be so penetrative, that they're driven on by a sense of devotion. So the Buddha qualifies that. He says there are two people, those who are driven by faith and those who are driven by curiosity, and usually have a better intelligence in order to achieve a deeper insight. So we have somebody called Puna. So he comes up in the Dhammapada. So Puna, he was a monk. He said of himself, whenever he learnt a new verse from the Buddha, it kicked the one he'd just learnt out of his head. So didn't have a very good memory. And his brother told him, well, you're just not going to understand the Dharma, and you may as well leave and do something useful in lay life. So when the Buddha heard about this, he went to see him, and he knew of the devotion that this Puna had towards himself and towards the practice, that he trusted him implicitly. So he gave him a cloth to rub. And while he's rubbing the cloth, he's supposed to be saying impermanence, impermanence, just watching impermanence. Well, he became fully liberated. And I don't think it works for everybody, but you can have a go. So that means that we don't have to have any big intellect to become liberated, right? It's really to do with opening up the intuitive intelligence, which is the active side of awareness. Remember that sati is satipanya. It's a passive awareness, observing, feeling, letting the information come, and then that moment of grasping. That's the intelligence working, an intuitive, a grasping intelligence. So, what of hope as such, and where does this aspiration sort of come from? So we have to understand that there's always going to be a subtle desire of trying to attain something for me, and that's of course this tanha, which translates as thirst. Right? It's a different type of tanha. Secondly, we see the impermanence. While we're meditating, while we're actually practicing, we can see the role of this tanha, this desire, and how that's a direct agent of creating suffering for ourselves. While we're practicing, we see impermanence. We can see things that are insubstantial. They're just arising and passing away. There's nothing that remains. And And so every so often, by being in that position, we come across a sort of hint as to what nibbana is. And here's where our real hope is grounded. So it's not in some future attainment. It's grounded in the fact that we can see these three characteristics more and more clearly. And then there comes that patience, to await for the great day of awakening. Just as two asides, because we're embedded in society and the way we live, the way we interact, the way we work, it affects others. So even on a day when we feel depressed, when things aren't going our way, there's the ability to rest somewhere within ourselves in the assurance of the Dharma that gives us an air of this acceptance. This is the way it is, and calmness. This too will pass. And so as we're heading along the path, there comes more and more acceptance, more and more contentment. Yeah, that's how it works. It's also of great value when we come to die, believing, to believe on our deathbed that we're dying into some sort of annihilation. It's not a particularly comforting thought. A poor return for a life that's generally done the best it can for the better of ourselves and others. So some say they are accepting this as humanists, but that's, of course, before the dying process. I struggled myself with this sort of contemplation in my 20s, but of course, at that time, you never believe you're going to die. So that's the presumption of youth. Even so, it did lead me to an understanding or to an experience that proved to me personally that death wasn't an end and that it was, in fact, another beginning. So similarly, when somebody's dying, it makes it easier for us to know that there is a purpose to life and that we don't have to rely on an outer power or a miracle to stop the process, but more accepting of it. So we have the experience, they have the example of the Buddha, of course, in his death, that we call the parinibbana, total nibbana. So which gives us an example of someone who reaches the goal just ready to let go of life. Even as he's dying, he's asking people around him if they've got any last questions. And then he says, don't be shy in asking and then regret that you didn't take this opportunity to do so. So in the actual discourses, when you read it and you come across the word hope and it says it's an absolute waste of time, it's a terrible thing to have. I think it's better to translate it as expectation, right? And that there is an aspiration, a real sort of grounded hope through the practice. That's where the hope is grounded, that we can see clearly that this desire is the direct cause of attachment, which creates suffering, etc., and that we can actually get rid of it. We just don't empower it, and it just disappears. And it's doing that until we finally get down to the core desire, which arises out of that sense of self, the core desire of wanting to become a person. That's your core. That's the core desire that we're really working with. So it energizes our practice if we do it that way. And, just have to be careful it doesn't corrupt into expectation. It's really putting our attention on process and abandoning any I dare say hope, but just not thinking about progress. So abandon progress and put your full attention upon process. That's it. I can only hope my words have been of some assistance, that by your practice you will find that path to liberation sooner, of course, rather than later.